Happy Monday, everybody. Every Monday I do my best of one, best of three standard review for Duskmourn. And best of one is in kind of a, not the best spot right now. Best of three is much healthier as far as the meta actually goes. So Boros Auras is still number one. It's a tier above the rest. Joining this week, though, we have a couple others that are looking to improve. And so what I like to do is I like to kind of track the changes throughout the weeks. And this week we did actually see some changes to the top performing deck for Bronze to Mythic on Untapped. So we can see this version of Boros Auras is dropping the 4 copies of the Manifold Mouse, as well as the 2 copies of the Monastery Swiftspear, to bring in 4 copies of the Slickshot Show-Off. And we're also dropping 4 copies of the Feather of Flight, which is the enchantment that draws a card and gives you flying, to bring in 2 more copies of the Demonic Ruckus, as well as 4 copies of Hammerhand. And you keep in mind that you can target your own creature with Hammerhand's ability to target creature can't block this turn. So if you have a Heartfire Hero and an Emberheart Challenger in play, Hammerhand can trigger Valiant for both. So just keep that in mind. So the general strategy of the deck is centered around the Heartfire Hero and the Sheltered by Ghosts. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because we've covered it so much throughout the weeks already. And the lands got tweaked a little bit, so we dropped a Plains and the 2 Thran Portals to bring in the 2 copies of the Restless Bivouac, which helps out if you are up against control. And as well as 1 copy of the Rockface Village, which again almost plays not like a land, but a repeatable combat trick that you can trigger the Valiant of your mice for 1 red. And so in case this is your first time hearing this over the 5 weeks, I do like to go over the matchups as well. So it's favored against Azorius Oculus. It's a coin flip against Rakdos Aggro and Golgari Midrange, and it's weak to mono black discard. The other thing that I'd like to start doing is talking about the best opening cards, and I kind of talked about it already, which is the Heartfire Hero and the Sheltered by Ghosts. I would recommend mulliganing until you have at least one of these cards, ideally both. And so that's number 1. Number 2 is Mardu Aggro, and I talked about this one last week. I wasn't sure if it was here to stay, and I can now more confidently say that this deck is a good variation of the Boros Auras and the Rakdos Aggro kind of brought together. And so this one, we also see some changes, so it hasn't come into its final form yet, dropping the 4 copies of the Monastery Swiftspear and the 4 copies of the Slickshot Show-Off to bring in 2 copies of the Manifold Mouse, and so bringing it all the way up to 4 on that one, and then the 4 copies of the Optimistic Scavenger, and cutting the 2 copies of the Demonic Ruckus to bring in the 4 copies of the Feather of Flight. So very similar cards, as you'll see. So this is taking a little bit more towards the Boros Auras side of it, whereas last week it was looking more like Rakdos Aggro. This one's also in Tier 1. I've used it to climb into High Diamond. I think I'm like 3 pips away from Mythic, so eventually we'll get there. As far as the lands go, they did drop a mountain and a Rockface Village to run the 2 Thran Portals, so you're kind of seeing like either or as an option, and something to consider there. I don't think there's really a truly correct one over the other. So as far as the best opening cards go, it's the same as the Boros Auras deck, which is the Heartfire Hero and the Sheltered by Ghosts. And this deck is favored against Rakdos Aggro. It is a very small sample size since we saw this version only come into existence last week. So with that, I don't have anything on like Azorius Oculus. I imagine it is because Boros Auras is good against it, and so you're improving the matchup just slightly against Rakdos Aggro. Again, it could just be a small sample size and return closer to 50%. It's a coin flip like against Golgari Midrange, and then it's weak to mono black discard. So really, it just seems like a second version of Boros Auras. Take your pick on whether or not you want to be running the Slickshot Show-Off or the Mice package in red. Number 3 is Rakdos Aggro, according to Untapped, and this is the 3rd deck in Tier 1. So this week we do see some changes. They dropped 1 copy of the Monastery Swiftspear to bring in a 4th copy of the Slickshot Show-Off. We also dropped 1 mountain to bring in the Blazemire Verge. And so this deck is pretty much figured out. It's been here for a while. So you have a turn 3 win off of Slickshot Show Off and Turn Inside Out, or the Felonious Rage. You need at least 2 damage, so Monstrous Rage works. So you need 2 on the Slickshot Show Off, or just 1 if you have the Leyline of Resonance in play, and then you can fling it with the Calisel Sword, so that allows you to do a turn 3 win. And then there's a turn 2 win with the Cacophony Scamp and the Heartfire Hero that you can then hit with a Turn Inside Out to make their power 7, and then fling it with the Calisel Sword to deal 3 times their power to hit them for 21. So very popular deck on the ladder, especially depending on what rank you're at. Yeah, you'll start to see a decrease in it generally in Diamond, and then you'll see an uptick again in Mythic. The best opening cards are the Leyline of Resonance, as well as the Heartfire Hero and the Turn Inside Out. So some people have been talking about banning the Leyline of Resonance, which would affect this deck, but getting rid of the Heartfire Hero would also decrease the number of options that you have to pull off the turn 2 win. As far as its matchups go, it's favored against Azorius Oculus, it's a coin flip against Boros Auras, and it's weak to Mono Black Discard. So all 3 of the top tier 1 decks kind of have the same strengths and weaknesses. And Mono Black Discard we don't actually see in the top 8, and we haven't for a little while, due to its poor matchups with the other decks. So the 3 that I just mentioned only represent about 10% of your games, if that, maybe 20, depending on where you are in the ladder. But the other 80% of the decks that you have to beat with Mono Black Discard then put it into tier 2. And when I was checking it, Tier 2 has 22 decks, so there's quite a diversity of decks, and Tier 2 can climb to Mythic. Like, you can hit Mythic with it, right? But the Mono Black Discard was number 20, so it's a little bit far down the list, so I won't be covering it this week. And but I did cover some Mono Black decks that I think are doing quite well in my Meta Breakers episode yesterday. And I promise we're going to get to a deck that's going to look a little bit different, so bear with me. Jund Aggro is the top of Tier 2, and it's a new archetype, sort of. So we've talked about Gruul Aggro before, and this is basically Gruul Aggro because we're playing Calisel Sword without any black, so it just allows you to play the Fling. The best opening cards are going to be the Leyline of Resonance and the Turn Inside Out. And it's favored against the Azorius Oculus deck. It's a coin flip against Rakdos Aggro and Boros Auras, and it's weak to Mono Black Discard. So this is the problem that is existing in Best of 1. So finally, to get to a non-Heartfire Hero archetype, we've got Mono White Control. And Mono White Control has actually been doing really well, especially in High Diamond and in Mythic. And so it does have some tough matchups, as we'll cover here shortly. So first up, the changes to the deck. So this list, deciding to drop the 2 Archangel Elspeth, as well as the 2 Enduring Innocence, and the 1 Lorn of the Third Path, to bring in 4 copies of the Overlord of the Mistmoors that we got in Duskmourn. It's also dropping 3 copies of the Soul Partition to run the Parting Gust, and 2 copies of the Virtue of Loyalty. And then as far as the lands go, we've got they dropped the Elegant Parlor, which probably was included last week because of being pulled from Best of 3, where you're running Imidane's Recruiter in the sideboard. And since we're not doing that, we're just bringing those Elegant Parlors out and bringing in the Plains. So the best opening cards are Parting Gust. Notably, that's because your most common matchup is likely to be Rakdos Aggro. Remember, this is aggregate data, so you're looking at the most common matchup from Bronze to Mythic is going to be Rakdos Aggro. And you may not be facing Rakdos Aggro yourself. Just keep that in mind. The favored... So you're not going to mulligan to get your Parting Gust because there's only 2 of them, right? And Control doesn't want to mulligan as much as Aggro does anyway. As far as the matchups go, it's favored against Mono Black Discard and Boros Auras, and so this is one of the decks that's causing Mono Black Discard to perform poorly. It's a coin flip against Rakdos Aggro, and then it is weak to Azorius Oculus, Boros Tokens, and Domain, which are not all incredibly popular picks on the ladder. Azorius Oculus, I think, is probably the most common of those 3. Yeah. Number 6 is Domain. And this is the first time that we've actually seen Domain pop into the top 8 in best of 1. Typically, it's a best of 3 deck, but it does do well in best of 1 if the meta is right. And so this last week, it seems like that was a good time for Domain to shine. We do see a couple of changes to the archetype, so we're leaning on the Overlord of the Hauntwoods instead of the Heaping Harvest or whatever to ramp us, and I think that's here to stay, giving us a better alternative than an enchantment that can get blown up, because you already get the land off of this, right? And then you've got your Up the Beanstalk, which pairs nicely with the Leyline Binding. This deck's been around since the World Championships when Raid Duke took it to Worlds last year. So changes have occurred, but we're still trying to, like, Attrax is a win condition, Herd Migration's a win condition, Sunfall and Temporary Lockdown to rat the board, lay down arms and get lost as the interaction. Doppelgang is an alternative win condition, and then you have Jason here, usually for the mirror match, because it's a very grindy one, to then mill your enemy domain player. So as far as the best opening cards go, again, this is looking at best of 1, not necessarily best of 3. Temporary Lockdown is going to be particularly nice to punish the Boros Auras deck, and the Overlord of the Hauntwoods allows you to get into the rest of your mana as well as gives you domain, so is also a top performing card in your opening hand. As far as the matchups go, it is favored against Mono Black Discard, is another reason why the Mono Black Discard's not in the top 8. It's also favored against Azorius Oculus, and it's a coin flip against Boros Auras. Kind of depends on whether or not you hit your Temporary Lockdown. You could improve this by increasing the amount of Temporary Lockdowns, but then this makes it worse against the control match. It is also weak to Rakdos Aggro. Number 7 is Mono Red Aggro. So this is what happens when you take the mouse core and you don't add any colors to it. It does perform significantly worse. This week we do see that they took out the 3 mountains and brought back the rock-faced village, so we're seeing kind of that come back and forth. The rest of the deck is figured out and is not changing. The best opening cards are Heartfire Hero, and that's it. And the favored matchups are Azorius Oculus, and then it's weak to Rakdos Aggro, Mono Black Discard, and Boros Auras. And then number 8 is Azorius Oculus, and just, 8 out of these decks are separated by like less than 1%, right? So like I said, there's 22, and I have to pick 5 of them to talk about. So Azorius Oculus squeaked in, and I thought Celestia Rabbits was actually doing quite well over the weekend, and it's number 9. So Azorius Oculus kicked it out. I was excited to actually talk about Celestia Rabbits, and so just like Mono Black Discard, you will bump into it on your ladder climb. You might bump into the Celestia Rabbits. It's less of a popular pick. As far as the changes to this archetype, we do see some, actually a fair amount happening this week. So Sleight of Hand getting dropped down to just a single copy, bringing in a 4th copy of Chart a Course. We're also dropping 1 copy of Into the Floodmaw and the 3 copies of the Phantom Interference, so getting rid of the Phantom Interference entirely. And then we're bringing out 2 copies of the Soul Partition and bringing in an additional copy of Afara's Dispersal, 2 copies of Get Lost, and 2 copies of Negate. Again, this was just the top performing one. This is not my personal choice or anything like that, right? This is just what the tracker is saying did the best between Bronze and Mythic. And 1 copy of Shore Up. Now, Negate is actually reasonable because card decks like Celestia Rabbits and Rakdos Lizards have kind of fallen out of popularity. There's a fair amount of non-creature spells in the meta. So I think, I'm not surprised to see its inclusion here. As far as lands go, we dropped in a Darker Waste to bring in, and 2 Meticulous Archives and a Plains to bring in an additional copy of the Flood Farm Verge, so popping that one up all the way to 4, and then just running 3 straight islands. So as far as this archetype goes, you're trying to cheese out a Haughty Djinn or an Abhorrent Oculus off of Recommission and Helping Hand. You have interaction through the into the Floodmaw and Get Lost, and then your enablers are your Chart a Course and Moment of Truth, as well as the Picklock Prankster. And then you can copy your Oculus or your Djinn once you get into a lot of mana with 3 steps ahead, or just use it for disruption. Shore Up is an inclusion that we don't usually see, that's coming in to just protect your, your thing that you brought to the board from removal. So The best opening cards for this, again, because the tracker is trying to stat itself well against Rakdos Aggro, is the Afara's Dispersal, and this allows you to then bounce their thing that they're trying to kill you with on turn 2 or turn 3. And so it was good to see that one was brought up this week. And as well as the Chart a Course. So Chart a Course then is how you one of the best ways to enable if you already have the Djinn or the Oculus in hand. So giving you that additional card draw. And you don't need to have attacked first if you know, because you want to be discarding the stuff from your hand ideally, right? If you already have an Oculus in play or a Djinn in play, things are usually going pretty well in this archetype. So that was another one that, like, good to see that kind of matched up with the best opening cards were upped this week. And it's favored against Mono Black Discard, another one against that deck, and it's weak against Rakdos Aggro and Boros Auras. All right, now let's talk about best of 3. We had 4 tournaments that spanned from Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So we're going to talk about the first and second place because we actually got a pretty decent representation of the meta in those placements. And some people have asked me about, like, why do I use the standard challenge on MTGO instead of just using the tracker untapped. And I've found personally that the untapped tracker and the best of 3 meta on Arena tends to just lag behind what's happening in the MTGO standard challenge. So but I'll do a little bit, I'll try to do my best to talk a little bit more about the matchups specifically in best of 3 to kind of give you an idea with what's going on in the ladder, right? So the most popular deck right now in the on Arena is Golgari Midrange, Dimir Midrange, and Domain. So there's kind of a rock, paper, scissors that I'll talk about here briefly. So I guess I'll talk about the matchups as I talk about the decks, right? So Gruul Aggro won first place on the 17th by Ura first, and it is the exact same list as the week before, except we've dropped 1 mountain to bring in an additional copy of the Thornspire Verge, and the best of 3 sideboard has no changes. So if you're new to the best of 3 meta, it is favored against Domain, it is favored against Dimir Midrange, it is a coin flip against Azorius Oculus, and it is weak against Golgari Midrange. Just to briefly talk about the sideboard, your Pick Your Poison is really good against Domain for destroying the enchantment and destroying Atraxa. Ghost Vacuum helps up against Azorius Oculus by being able to attack the graveyard. Obliterating Bolt and Scorching Shot are good for mid-range blockers, more like the more of what you would experience in Golgari Midrange with, like, Shieldred, Glissa, etc. Pop Hatch Formation. Oh, they both do the same thing. Okay, well, this is a very similar version to Pick Your Poison, but instead of giving you Artifact Hate, you would then have the ability to cycle it and create a food token. So similarly, you're going to be bringing in one of these for against the Domain matchups. Torch the Tower is good to bring in on the draw when you're up against other aggro decks. And Urabrask's Forge is good to bring in specifically against Mono Black single point interaction, since Mono Black struggles outside of Duress to deal with the Urabrask's Forge. Alright, second place was 4 Color Control by Mandrill Man, and this is kind of where I think we might, at least this week, we saw this archetype kind of being played over Domain. And it has a lot of similar Domain cards, though, right? So we have Up the Beanstalk, we got the Doppelgang, we've got the Leyline Binding, we've got the Sunfalls. Not running the temporary lockdowns in the best of 3 version. Kind of depends on what the meta is for that inclusion. We still have the ramp off of the Overlord of the Hauntwoods, and then we've got the Overlord of the Boiler Bilges and the Overlord of the Mistmoors to just overwhelm our opponent in value. We're not doing any of the Zur, the Enchanter, or anything like that. Just ramp into Broken Mythics and then copy those Broken Mythics with Doppelgang and Up the Beanstalk to draw cards and disrupt them with the Get Lost in the Leyline. So very cool. I don't know about the matchups if it's I assume it's similar to Domain, but only time will tell. As far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, here we've got Elspeth's Smite. Domain typically is weak against, like, the Gruul Midrange or the Gruul Aggro decks, right? So you'd be bringing this in against, like, Gruul Aggro. to eliminate their early pressure. Azorius Oculus then gets the Ghost Vacuum treatment. Exercise is really good for the artifact and enchantment hate. Anytime I see enchantment and then power 4 greater, it makes me think of like Domain. So you'd be bringing this one in against the mirror match. We've got the 4 copies of Negate, which you could bring in against any other control matchup, anything that's running a lot of non-creature spells. And then Tranquil Frillback you can use against Azorius Oculus to attack their graveyard. You can also bring it in if they have a high number of problematic artifact and enchantments like Urbrask's Forge. You can also just bring it in against aggro for the gain 4 life. All right, now for the 18th, we've got a first place winner, Golgari Midrange by Victor Calvalho, 01. And we have a substantial amount of changes to talk about this week because, so Golgari hasn't really found, it hasn't been figured out yet, right? Like Gruul Aggro, we have like 2 changes to the deck list, right? Golgari Midrange, on the other hand, we've seen kind of fluctuate. And so we've got 2 different versions this week. So we'll kind of talk about the difference between both of them, right? So this week, we're dropping 1 copy of the Archfiend of the Dross as a particularly problematic threat for red-based removal. We're dropping the 4 copies of the Caustic Bronco, and because we're dropping the Caustic Bronco, we're also getting rid of the Sentinel of the Nameless City, which is a 3-drop with 3 power that can saddle the Caustic Bronco. And then we're also dropping 1 copy of the Shieldred the Apocalypse to bring in a 3rd copy of Glissa Sunslayer, which I thought was interesting. 1 additional copy of the Harvester of Misery, and this one can be a particularly good. It gives you an instant speed interaction. You can discard it from your hand. You don't have to cast it for 5, right? So it kind of gives you the Choking Miasma effect later in the game if that's what you want as well. So there's a little bit of versatility in this. I think most of the time you're going to end up discarding this against aggro, though. As far as, let's see, 2 more copies of the Tranquil Frillback. I think it's relatively well positioned with Azorius Oculus being not uncommon to bump into, and then also Gruul Aggro is relatively common in the tournament. So Gruul Aggro's in the top 5 on Arena as well. So it's a decent tech card and has some decent flexibility. As far as the sorceries go, so we've dropped 2 copies of the Duress to bring in 3 copies of the Analyze the Pollen, and this helps us kind of smooth our land draws as well as becomes a tutor effect later in the game. We brought in 4 copies of the Cruel Claws Heist. So instead of leaning on Duress, we're leaning on the Cruel Claws Heist. Similar kind of vibe, a little bit more expensive with the double pit black. But gets the job done, which is basically you're trying to get rid of Sunfalls in your opponent's hand, right? Because the reason why Golgari disappeared for a super long time is because it's not great against Domain, and specifically because of the Sunfalls. So you're able to snipe that out of their hand with the Cruel Claws Heist. We're also running 3 copies of the Gix's Command, right? So this card works particularly well at destroying any of the go wide strategies. Also gives you some against control, being able to bring your creatures back, and then also stabilization with the lifelink against aggro. So Gix's Command is another one that's also a very versatile card. We got 1 copy of Pillage the Bog, which is another kind of tutor effect, being able to just look an obscene amount down into your deck for the card that you need. We're dropping all 4 copies of the Cutdown, which usually, last week that was being played because of how much Gruul Aggro there was. So with the 4 copies being eliminated, I imagine that the Gruul Aggro has gone down a little bit in popularity. We're running 2 copies of the Anoint with Affliction. Again, this is usually one that you want to bring in against the Mosswood Dread Knight in the mirror match. What that tells me is that we're seeing more Golgari Midrange instead of the Gruul Aggro. And I guess I could always look these up, they do post the percentages. So anyway, we've got the Unholy Annex was dropped from this list, and we're running 1 more copy of the Virtue of Persistence. And then for the lands, we've got 1 forest and 2 mountain ports and 2 swamps that were dropped from the list, so not running the fountain ports. Running an additional copy of the Demolition Field and 2 copies of the 2 more copies of the Underground Mortuary. And just, classic Golgari mid-range stuff, value and removal. So the best of 3 sideboard also got a pretty good rework. So we've moved the Anoint with Afflictions from the sideboard to the main. We've dropped the 2 copies of the Choking Miasma, as well as the 2 copies of the Cruel Claws Heist. Dropped the Disfigure, which is another tech card that you'd bring in against Gruul Aggro. Dropped 1 Gix's Command because we upped the total count in the main. Dropped a Terra Sunder, so we do still have 1, but we no longer have 2. And then the Tranquil Frillbacks we brought into this the main, so we got rid of them in the sideboard. And we saw a card here that we don't usually see, which I kind of got a chuckle out of, which is the Blade Coil Serpent. And it's not getting cast for anything other than the black, right? So each opponent discards a card. It's a way to kind of lean into... so by bringing in the Blade Coil Serpent and the Cruelty of Gix and the Duresses and the Cruel Claws Heist, like, you can go really hard on attacking their hand, and I think that that's a way to answer 4-color control. And so that seems to be the strategy that they were at least going, because they brought the Duress up to 4 from 2. Also, we've got 3 copies of the Harvester of Misery, so if we really want to shut down the Gruul Aggro decks and the go wide strat like Rakdos Lizards, which we haven't seen as much, Harvester of Misery is a good option for that. Liliana of the Veil, to bring that one up to 2 copies, so we could also go super hard at attacking their hand. So you can almost play this like a Golgari discard deck, which I think is kind of cool. We have a second copy of Nissa Ascended Animist if they have a lot of artifact and enchantments. And then we've also got, I already mentioned the Cruelty of Gix, I think, is when you switch it into hand hate mode. Oh, before I forget, let's talk about the most common one you're going to bump into on the arena ladder, right? So this deck is favored against Gruul Aggro, but the reason why I don't think it's actually that great, despite it being the most played pick, right? It's weak against Domain, which in the tournament scene, this got a first place win because Domain's not there, right? 4-color control is, but not Domain. It's weak against Domain, which is like the 3rd most common one you're going to bump into on arena ladder. You've got to, and again, this is just for most people, right? There's always exceptions. Azorius Oculus, it's also weak to, and it's also weak to Dimir Midrange. So Azorius Oculus was the 5th one that I forgot, right? So, Golgari Midrange, Dimir Midrange, Domain, Azorius Oculus, and Gruul Aggro. Those are your top 5. All right, second place on the 18th was taken down by Gruul Aggro by O. Daniel Akos. We're going to skip it this week because it was the exact same list as Ura first, so that's 2 points for Gruul Aggro. And first place on the 19th was taken down by Mono Black Midrange by Iron Beagle. And this is a new archetype. It's the first time that we've talked about Mono Black specifically in Best of 3. And we've seen this, I talked about it in my Best of 1 Meta Breakers. It's been winning tournaments, so this is the first time that we're talking about it in the Standard Challenge, but it's won in Japan and such, right? And I think even CGB did a breakdown of it 3 weeks ago on the MTG Arena channel even, right? Like the Mono Black Slasher deck, right? It combines with the Bloodletter of Aclazotz to get the 1-turn kill with the Slasher. And then because you're playing this demon already, and the Archfiend of the Dross, you have really great synergies with the Unholy Annex. And so being able to create your own demons and then being able to hit your opponent while you're drawing cards gives you just amazing late game value for a black control deck. 1 copy of Shieldred the Apocalypse gives us a little bit of life gain off of the Unholy Annex, which can be nice too. And then we just have a plethora of removal, right? So cut downs, the Deep Cavern Bat, go for the throat, Shieldred's Edict, Duress. The Caustic Bronco in here is more for card drawing than it is for saddling, because nothing really has a great ability to saddle it until Archfiend of the Dross and Shieldred the Apocalypse, which I guess you get to do it like the turn you get to play it. And the combined cost of this card is you do get to pop them for 8 if you do draw it with the Caustic Bronco. So it's kind of a nice synergy. As far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we've got Disfigure for Gruul Aggro, Ghost Vacuum for Azorius Oculus, Anoint with Affliction for Golgari Midrange, Caustic Bronco for the decks that don't punish the early interaction. I don't actually know the top. I don't know this one off the top of my head, to be honest. Gix's Command, again, depending on the matchup, whether or not you need it to like wipe a board or give you the lifelink stabilization. Could work in decks that don't have the exile effect, that are just destroying your demons as well. Liliana the Veil for against control, being able to attack their hand. Malicious Eclipse for against like Gruul Aggro. Withering Torment also gives you enchantment hate, and Yeah. All right, and Jeskai Convoke by Manny took down second on the 19th, and we talked about this one last week as well. As we see more and more of the meta switching into single point interaction like black removal, then Convoke is still here. It's still occasionally popping up into the top. You will not bump into this deck very often in Arena. That's been my experience at least. And we see very few changes. This deck has been around for a while, so it's largely figured out, right? So we're dropping 1 Mirrex to bring in an additional copy of the Darker Wastes. Nothing else has changed in the main. We do have a couple of things that I'll just talk about really briefly because they are new from Duskmourn. Painter's Studio made it into the cut, same with the Sheltered by Ghosts, and the Clockwork Percussionist works well to synergize with the Gleeful Demolition. The whole point of this deck is to get a turn 2 Convoke off of the Knight Errant of Eos, and then play a turn 3 Imidane's Recruiter. That's when all of the stars align, by using the Gleeful Demolition on some form of artifact. As far as the best of 3 goes, or best of 3 sideboard goes, this person decided to run a 12-card sideboard, so did not bring a full, complete sideboard to the tournament, but did well enough anyway. Always love to see it. So we dropped the Arabella and the 2 copies of Get Lost and 1 Torch the Tower to bring in an additional copy of Destroy Evil. Sheltered by Ghosts then can help us up against like Gruul Aggro. Protect the Negotiators helps up against Control, where they're going to Wrath our board, specifically like Temporary Lockdown and Sunfall. Torch the Tower also gives you some sauce against Gruul Aggro. Rest in Peace is the sideboard inclusion for Azorius Oculus. And yeah. All right, first place was Golgari Midrange by Jacob Pablo. Okay, sorry. It's first place on the 20th. And you can see this is a different approach, right, than the Golgari Midrange that I talked about earlier by Victor Calvinho. And so I'm going to compare it to the week before. Sometimes I'll compare it to the same list, but this one was closer to the one that we talked about last week. So I'll talk about that instead of comparing it to the other one. So this one's dropping Liliana the Veil, not running it in the main, also dropping the Sentinel of the Nameless City, but keeping the Caustic Broncos, which I thought was interesting because I like Sentinel of the Nameless City to be able to more easily saddle the Caustic Bronco. But Tranquil Frillback got dropped down to a single copy, and again, it's kind of depending on what matchups you're expecting with that one. Shield of the Apocalypse got dropped down to 1 copy as well, and we brought in 2 additional copies of the Archfiend of the Dross to more fully lean into the Unholy Annex. We also have a 3rd copy of the Glissa Sunslayer, so both lists I think we're running the 3 copies of Glissa Sunslayer, which can be really problematic for enchantment decks and Planeswalkers. We're also bringing in the 2 copies of Duress, and to make room for it, we're dropping 1 Cut Down. Again, kind of a signal to me that there was a little bit less Gruul Aggro. 1 Terra Sunder is out, and we're bringing in 2 more Anoint with Afflictions for more Golgari mid-range mirror matches. We're also taking out a Virtue of Persistence to run 2 additional Unholy Annexes. So we're doing a full playset, and I think that's largely why we see an increase in the Archfiend of the Dross. As far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we've dropped an Anoint with Affliction and the Cruel Claws Heist, as well as the Disfigure and the Duresses, to then bring in the Aclazotz. And Aclazotz is one that's like, it's good against like Dimir midrange, Gruul midrange, or Gruul Aggro, where if you can make it to turn 5, then this can be a really good stabilizing force, as long as they don't really have an easy way to exile it. It's less good against white for that reason. And we've also got the Ghost Vacuums to hit on Azorius Oculus, the Harvester of Misery. Again, I think this one is a nice one against the Gruul Aggro decks. And then Liliana the Veil is in the sideboard, so we do have 2 copies there. If we're up against Control, we can kind of switch it into that. And a 1 copy of the Tranquil Frillback, so we can bring in 2 copies from the sideboard if we're up against a deck that against a matchup that needs the Graveyard Hate or the Life Stabilization or the Artifact or Enchantment Hate. All right, and the last deck that we're going to talk about this week is Azorius Oculus. Took down 2nd place on the 20th by Shiva Veto. And this list is, like, it's getting close to its final form. I think the last thing to figure out is the spells. And so this one is bringing in the Chart of Course, like we saw in Best of One, dropping into the Floodmaw, like we also saw in Best of One. Or more likely we saw it in here and then it's happening in Best of One, right? Moment of Truth getting dropped by one to bring in an additional Soul Partition. So this one being good interaction against the early aggression. And same strategy to the Best of One deck. And the sideboard, we've got kind of a simplification. So we're dropping the 2 Doorkeeper Thralls, and so that one was good for Domain, silencing the ETBs of Atraxa and the Archangel. We're dropping the 2 copies of the Kutzel's Flanker, which is the Azorius Oculus like counter, and we're also dropping 1 copy of the Soul Partition that we brought into the main, and we're bringing in 3 Fairy Masterminds, which is specifically for the decks that are really good at drawing cards, right? So they up the Beanstalk decks, the Boros tokens, Caretaker decks, anything like that where your opponent is drawing more cards than they should. Fairy Mastermind is a decent way to punish that, and works okay in this strategy. And then the Monastery Mentor too allows us to kind of switch into, so Fairy Mastermind and Monastery Mentor we can kind of bring in if they're really good at destroying our graveyard, right? So the Monastery Mentor then gives us an additional win condition that's a little less graveyard centric. So as far as the matchups for Azorius Oculus goes, it's good against Golgari Midrange and it's good against Dimir Midrange, which I think makes it a pretty good deck for climbing the ladder on Arena. It's a coin flip against Gruul Aggro, and so if we're seeing a decrease in Gruul Aggro, it's not a huge boon for it. It would be more helpful if we saw a decrease in Domain, which is its weakness. So right now, there's no Domain, or I should say there's less Domain than what we saw earlier in the tournaments, and so this was a good time for Azorius Oculus to shine. And with that, I hope that helps explain everything that's going on in Best of One and the more complex Best of Three meta. I didn't do the best job describing the strengths and weaknesses of the rock, paper, scissors of Best of Three. You can always hit me up if you have any questions and want me to try to explain it in text. Sometimes I can do that better. And if you found this information helpful, remember to hit like and subscribe, and consider becoming a YouTube member or even sending me a donation or a sub on Twitch. Appreciate the support. Kind of, keeps me going. And tomorrow I've got a draft video. I don't bug you guys with notifications on my draft videos because they're like 2 hours long or whatever. Some people enjoy them, some people don't. So if you like that sort of thing, you can watch my 4th trophy in a row in Azorius for Duskmourn Draft or Limited. And throughout the week, I'll see if I can get around to a gameplay video. I haven't really been able to recently get much time for it. But next Sunday, I'll be doing my Best of One Meta Breakers, where we talk about off-meta picks and then just kind of rinse and repeat. But tomorrow, there will be the community deck text will open up. So if you would like my thoughts on any of your home brews or any Best of One or Best of Three standard deck, I would be happy to take a look at it. And that will be available on the community tab tomorrow. So take care, everybody. Thank you for being a part of my community and listening to my ramblings. And have a wonderful week.